She was already on her knees when the lock gave way. The morning fog still clung to the Kentucky fields, thick and low, the kind that swallowed fence posts and made the world feel smaller than it was. Rosalind Pruitt pressed the crowbar behind the hasp of the barn door, felt the resistance of rusted metal against rotting wood, and pulled. The screws held for one moment the way things do when they have been holding on too long. Then they tore free. The padlock dropped into the weeds. She pushed the door open with both hands. Cold air moved past her out of the darkness and into the gray morning. The smell hit her first: old hay and damp timber, and something underneath both of those things, something she could not name yet. She stood at the threshold and looked in. She did not go inside, not yet. She stepped back and looked at the barn, at the whole property, at the farmhouse behind her, with its peeling paint and sagging porch, at the fields, stretching flat and bare in every direction. $47 was what she had in her coat pocket. One suitcase was what she had inside the house. This was what was left of 70 years of living. 6 weeks ago, she had left Columbus on a Greyhound bus. This is how it began. Gordon Pruitt died on a Tuesday in October. He died the way he had lived the last few years, quietly, without making a fuss, without asking for anything. Rosalind found him in his recliner, with the television still running and his coffee still warm enough that for one terrible moment she thought he was only sleeping. The paramedics said it was his heart. Rosalind could have told them his heart had been giving out for a long time. She had watched it happen the way you watch a season change so gradually that each individual day looks almost the same as the one before, until one morning you look out the window and everything is different. 300 people came to the funeral. That was the number that stayed with her afterward, 300, because she had stood beside Gordon's casket for 4 hours and shaken every hand and said thank you for coming, and meant it every single time, even when her feet ached and her chest felt like something hollow where a person used to be. Clifford wore a charcoal suit. He was 47 years old and ran the insurance agency his father had built from a desk in a rented office with one phone line and a second-hand copier. He shook hands the way men shake hands when they understand that funerals are also in their way professional occasions, firmly, with eye contact, with the practiced expression of someone accounting for every person in the room. Harriet stood beside her brother in a black dress and pearls, holding a tissue she never actually needed. She was 44 and sold commercial real estate in the suburbs north of Columbus, and she had their father's way of scanning a room, always noting exits, always calculating distance. Rosalind stood and thanked people and watched her children work the room and felt something she could not quite identify. It was not anger. It was not grief, or not only grief. It was something more like recognition, the beginning of understanding something she had not let herself understand yet. Near the end of the receiving line, an old man approached her alone. He was 82 if he was a day, walking with a cane, wearing a suit that had fit him better 20 years ago. He took her hand in both of his and held it. Gordon was a good man, he said. His name was Orville Gantry, and she did not know him, had never met him at any company event or holiday party or neighborhood gathering in 53 years of marriage. But he should have protected you better, Rosalind. She started to ask what he meant. He had already turned away, already moving toward the door with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who had said what he came to say. She watched him go. She watched him glance once toward Clifford, something brief and unreadable, and then he was gone into the October afternoon. She did not forget the look. She followed it away in the part of her mind that had spent 35 years teaching 7th graders and had learned to notice things people did not intend to show. 2 weeks after the funeral, Clifford called a family meeting. He used those exact words, family meeting, as though they were going to discuss vacation plans or what to do about Thanksgiving. Rosalind drove to his house, the house she and Gordon had helped him buy 15 years ago, when he and Marvella were just starting out, when the down payment was more than Clifford could manage on his own, when they had written the check without hesitation, because that was what you did for your children. She sat at his dining room table. The table was mahogany, purchased about 3 years ago. She had admired it when they bought it. Now she sat across from it like a stranger. Clifford sat at the head. Harriet sat to his left with a folder. Marvella sat at the other end of the table with a stack of documents that was thicker than Harriet's. She had positioned herself at the far end rather than at Clifford's side, and Rosalind noticed this without letting herself think about what it meant. "Mom, we need to talk about Dad's estate," Clifford said. Rosalind nodded. She had expected this. Gordon had built a real life. The house was paid off. The insurance agency was profitable. There was money in savings and investments and a retirement account they had contributed to for decades. There were things to discuss. She had told herself she was ready for this conversation. She had not been ready for Marvella to open the first document before Clifford had finished his sentence. Clifford walked her through it methodically. The house. 12 years ago, he explained Gordon had added Clifford's name to the deed. Estate planning, he said. A practical decision made after Gordon's first cardiac episode. He said it in the tone of a man reciting facts that are unfortunate but settled. Rosalind looked at him. She remembered the conversation Gordon had described, the one where the lawyer had suggested it, the one where Gordon had come home and mentioned it over dinner, as though it were a minor administrative detail. She had not thought about it again until this moment. "So technically, the house is mine," Clifford said. He did not look away. He also did not look comfortable. "I'm not asking you to leave Mom, but Marvella and I have been thinking. The kids are getting bigger. The property taxes, the upkeep. It's a lot for one person to manage." "You want me to leave the house," Rosalind said. "Transition," Harriet said. She said it gently. "We found a place, Mom. It's really lovely. Sunrise Gardens over in Westerville. The amenities are incredible." Rosalind looked at her daughter. "I'm 70 years old, Harriet. I'm not 85. "Nobody is saying you can't take care of yourself," Harriet said. "We're saying it might be easier, safer." "And the bank accounts," Rosalind said. Harriet glanced at Clifford. Just for a moment, but Rosalind saw it. "We moved the funds into a trust," Clifford said. "For estate management purposes. Harriet and I are co-trustees." "You emptied the accounts," Rosalind said. "We secured the accounts." He said it evenly, as though the difference between those two phrases were obvious to anyone paying attention. Rosalind sat very still. She thought about the late nights she had spent doing Gordon's books, in the early years of the agency, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were asleep with the ledgers spread open and a cup of tea going cold beside her. She thought about the vacations they had skipped and the repairs they had delayed, and the years of small choices made in favor of the future of building something that would last. 47 years of that, divided in an afternoon. "And the car," she said. "Harriet needs it," Clifford said. "You don't drive much anymore. It just sits in the garage." Marvella spoke for the first time. Her voice was even practiced, the voice of a woman who had thought through this conversation well in advance. "Rosalind, we want what's best for you. We both do. We've done a lot of research into different options." Rosalind looked at the stack of documents in front of Marvella. She looked at the tabs that Marvella had placed along the edges. Color-coded tabs. This had not been put together in the 2 weeks since the funeral. This had been in preparation for longer than that. "Is there anything left?" Rosalind asked quietly. Clifford checked his legal pad. "There's Grandpa Aldis's farm," he said. "Out in Kentucky, County Road 9 near Dawson. Dad always said it was worthless." Harriet leaned forward and almost laughed. "Not quite, but almost. There are back taxes, Mom, about $11,000. The county sent notices for years and nobody responded. The property is assessed at less than the taxes owed. Nobody would buy it. It's basically a liability at this point." Rosalind had looked at the table for a moment. The mahogany grain ran in long, straight lines from one end to the other. "I'll take it," she said. Clifford blinked. "Take what?" "The farm. I'll take the farm." Harriet leaned forward. "Mom, there's nothing there. The house is barely standing. There's no functioning water." "You said it's mine," Rosalind said. "My father left it to me, not to a trust, not to you, to me." "It's worthless," Clifford said. "Then you won't mind if I keep it." Neither of them argued. There was no reason to argue. They had the house and the money and the car and the agency. The farm was a joke, a piece of paper representing a debt, a piece of land that had not produced anything worth talking about in decades. They had gotten everything that mattered. What Rosalind noticed and filed away without reaction was Marvella. When Rosalind said, "I'll take it," Marvella's hand paused over her documents for exactly 1 second before continuing. It was the first moment in the entire conversation where Marvella had done something she had not planned for. It was not relief that crossed her face in that second. It was recalculation. Rosalind left Clifford's house that evening with her purse, her coat, and her father's pocket watch. The watch was brass, heavy, warm from being against her body for so many years. Aldous Branscombe had pressed it into her hands during her last visit to the farm when he was dying of emphysema, and she was 48 years old and did not know yet that it would be the last time she saw him upright. "Keep this," he had said. "You'll know when you need it." She had never known what he meant. She had carried the watch for 22 years without knowing. On the back, engraved in the brass by hand, were 4 numbers she had always assumed were a date. She stayed in Clifford's guest bedroom for 22 days. Marvella did not ask her to leave. She did not have to. She sighed when Rosalind used the kitchen in the morning. She left brochures on the nightstand: Sunrise Gardens, Peaceful Meadows, Whispering Pines, places whose names were designed to help you forget you were being put away. She told the grandchildren to keep the noise down because Grandma needed her rest, which translated in practice to a kind of managed silence that made Rosalind feel she was already gone and everyone was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. On the 17th night, Rosalind got up at 11 o'clock because she could not sleep. She walked to the kitchen for a glass of water and found Marvella sitting at the table with her laptop open. Rosalind looked at the screen before Marvella could close it. 3 browser tabs: Sunrise Gardens pricing, Memory Care Ohio, how to assess elder competency. The tabs were not new. The browser had a history feature, and Rosalind could see from across the room that the pages had been visited more than once. "Can't sleep either," Marvella said. Her voice was perfectly calm. "No," Rosalind said. "I know this is hard," Marvella said. "Clifford worries, we both do." Rosalind poured her glass of water. She looked at the laptop screen. She looked at Marvella's face, composed and watchful in the kitchen light. "You've been researching this for a while," Rosalind said. It was not a question. Marvella did not answer. She closed the laptop. Rosalind went back to her room. She did not cry. She had already done that into a pillow in the dark on nights when the house was quiet enough to risk it. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and understood that she had been waiting for permission to leave. She stopped waiting. On the 22nd morning, she packed her 1 suitcase. Everything she owned fit inside it. She called the bus station from Clifford's phone while he was at work, and Harriet was at a showing, and Marvella was at the grocery store. She wrote Clifford a note that said she was going to the farm. She left it on the kitchen counter. She took a cab to the station. The Greyhound from Columbus to Dawson, Kentucky cost $37 and left at 2 in the afternoon. Rosalind sat by the window and watched the flat Ohio suburbs give way to rolling Kentucky hills stripped bare by late autumn. And she did not look at her phone because she did not have one anymore. Clifford had canceled the plan, and she did not think about what came next because what came next was the farm, and she had enough sense to take things one at a time. She had $47 left when the bus pulled into the Dawson gas station at dusk. The driver called it the closest stop to County Road 9. She thanked him and stepped down onto the pavement with her suitcase. The attendant inside the gas station looked at her the way people look at someone who has arrived somewhere unexpected. When she asked for directions to the old Branscombe farm, he scratched the back of his neck and said he did not know Aldous Branscombe had any family. "I'm his daughter," Rosalind said. "Huh," he said. He gave her directions. She walked 4 miles on a road with no shoulder, the suitcase bumping against her hip in a rhythm that became almost meditative over the second hour. A truck slowed as it passed her. The driver, a heavy-set woman in a feed cap, rolled her window down. "You need a ride, hon." "I'm almost there," Rosalind said. "Where's there?" "The Branscombe farm." The woman's eyebrows went up. She looked at Rosalind at the suitcase at the road ahead. Then she drove on. The farm was worse than Rosalind remembered. She had been here last 22 years ago, and memory had softened the edges. The driveway was barely visible under 2 decades of weeds and volunteer saplings that had pushed up through the gravel. The farmhouse sat at the end of it, 2 stories of wood that had been white once and was now bare in most places, the paint having given up sometime in the previous decade. One upstairs window was broken. The porch listed to the left where the supports had gone soft. Behind the house stood the barn. The roof had partially collapsed on the south end. The walls had faded from red to a weathered gray that was almost colorless. On the main door, a padlock hung on the hasp. It was old and rusted, but it was intact. It had been locked for as long as Rosalind could remember. Her father had kept that barn locked her entire childhood. "That's my workshop," he used to say. "Nothing in there for little girls." When she was 12, she had tried to peek through a gap in the siding, and Aldous had raised his voice, the only time in her memory he had ever raised his voice at her, and she had never tried again. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the front door of the house. It was unlocked. Aldous had never locked the house. Only the barn. Inside, dust covered everything. The air smelled of trapped time. She set the suitcase down in the hallway and walked through the room, slowly touching things. The kitchen still had dishes in the cabinets, plates with a blue flower pattern she remembered from childhood. Her father's leather recliner sat positioned near the living room window, angled so a person sitting in it would have a clear view of the barn. She tried the fuse box. Nothing. She tried the kitchen faucet. Dry. She sat on the edge of her father's chair and looked out the window at the padlocked barn in the fading light, and for reasons she was not yet able to articulate, being here felt more like home than Clifford's guest bedroom had felt in 3 weeks. The first night she slept on a bare mattress under a quilt her mother had made before Rosalind was born. The stitching was coming loose in places, but it held the warmth. She woke before dawn to birds, real birds close and loud, the kind of sound that meant the world outside was moving on its own without needing anything from her. She got up and started cleaning. 3 days of it. Every floor swept, every surface wiped down, mold scraped from bathroom tile with a butter knife, armloads of dead leaves and animal nests carried out to a burn pile at the edge of the yard. On the second afternoon, a truck slowed at the end of the driveway and a man got out. He was 65 broad through the shoulders with gray hair cut close and hands that looked as though they had been doing real work every day of his life. He wore a canvas jacket with mud on the boots. "You living here?" he asked from the edge of the property, the way people ask things in places where privacy is understood to be real. "I am," Rosalind said. "Water's been shut off," he said. "Electricity, too. You'll need to call the county to get them reconnected. Probably a couple hundred for the deposits." "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." He nodded and started back to his truck. Then he stopped. "I'm Garland Sutter. I live about 2 miles past your property line. Your father and I used to sit on the bench outside the post office sometimes." He paused. He was a quiet man. "That sounds like him," Rosalind said. Garland got back in his truck and drove away. She had $47. The next morning, there was an envelope in the mailbox. No return address. Inside, $300 in 20s and a piece of paper with handwriting that shook slightly the way old hands shake. Aldous was a good neighbor. Welcome home. She stood at the mailbox for a long time holding the money and the note. She did not know who had sent it. She did not go looking for answers. She called the county office from Garland's phone when he passed by again the following day, and by the end of the week, the water ran clear and the lights came on in every room except the upstairs bathroom. She found mason jars of preserved vegetables in the cellar, sealed tight her father's work from years ago, still good. She cooked her first meal on the old gas stove and ate at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the barn. Always the barn. She walked 4 miles into town the following Tuesday because the pantry was running low on staples. Fulcher's Hardware was a single long room that sold everything from roofing nails to canned tomatoes. And Rosalind had come to understand that it was also in a town this size one of the primary places where information moved. The woman behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle when the bell above the door sounded. She was 58 with platinum hair pulled back and eyes that took in the room the way a person's eyes do when they have spent decades in one place and noticed everything that changed. "Help you find something," she said, not quite a question. I need a sledgehammer, Rosalind said. In a pry bar. The woman set down her pencil. She studied Rosalind for a moment, taking in the height and the build and the age, and then she stood up without commentary and led her to the back of the store. Aisle 3, 10-pound, not 16, save your back. Her name was Laverne Fulcher. She owned the store the way people own things when they have built them themselves and have no intention of letting them go. Rosalind was counting out bills at the register when the door opened. Garland Sutter walked in with a box of wood screws and set them on the counter and looked at Rosalind's purchases. That's a lot of sledgehammer for one person, he said. I'll manage, Rosalind said. Which barn? She thought about giving a vague answer. She was too tired for vague answers. Aldous Branscom's place. Something shifted in Garland's expression. Something between surprise and recognition. Aldous' place. You his daughter, Rosalind. Yes, Garland Sutter. He set the screws down. We spoke the other day, but I didn't catch the connection then. Rosalind nodded. He looked at the sledgehammer again. What are you doing with the barn floor? She matched his directness. There's a concrete floor in the barn. I need to see what's under it. Garland raised an eyebrow. Concrete floor in a barn. That's unusual. He was quiet for a moment. I've got a jackhammer in my shed. Pneumatic runs off a compressor. Save you a week of work and 3 herniated discs. Why would you help me? Because Aldous was a good man. And swinging a sledgehammer at concrete alone at your age is a good way to end up in the hospital with nobody to drive you there. Laverne Fulcher's voice came from the far end of the counter. Garland, just the one word. Garland turned. Laverne was looking at him with the expression of someone who had opinions she was deciding whether to voice. Be careful out there, she said. It was unclear whether she meant it for Garland or for Rosalind or for both of them. Garland came by the next morning at 6:45 with the compressor and the jackhammer strapped in the bed of a dented Ford pickup. Rosalind had found a percolator in the kitchen cabinet and had coffee ready when she heard the truck coming up the driveway. The smell of it filled the house, real coffee in a house that had been empty for 22 years, and for a moment she stood in the kitchen and just let that be what it was. They sat on the porch in the cool morning and drank without much conversation. The sky was pale gray and the fields ran flat and bare to the tree line in every direction. I helped your father fix this porch about 30 years ago, Garland said, looking at the boards under their chairs. He did most of the work himself, just needed someone to hold the boards while he nailed. He was always building something, Rosalind said. Always out here working on something. He just never said what. Garland set his mug on the porch rail and stood. Let's go see that floor. Inside the barn, they moved carefully, testing each step, the old boards soft but holding. Garland walked the perimeter while Rosalind watched, kicking hay aside, kneeling to knock on the concrete, pressing his ear down and listening. The floor was poured smooth wall to wall, nothing like any barn floor Rosalind had ever seen. When Garland reached the northeast corner, he stopped. He knocked. He listened. He knocked again. There's something under here, he said. This section sounds different. The rest is solid, poor, probably 8 inches thick. But right here. Rosalind came closer. She knelt beside him and pressed her ear to the cold concrete and knocked with her knuckles. The sound that came back was deep and resonant and hollow. Not the flat answer of solid material, the answer of a space. She sat back on her heels and looked at Garland. Start the compressor, she said. The jackhammer did not ease into it. It hit the concrete the way a hard truth hits suddenly and without apology, and the sound bounced off the barn walls and sent the last of the sparrows out through the broken roof and into the gray Kentucky morning. Rosalind stood back with a rag over her nose and mouth and watched Garland work. He moved in a straight line along the northeast corner, chipping away a 3-foot section at a time, methodical and unhurried. Chunks of concrete broke free and skittered across the old hay. Dust rose in a pale cloud that the weak winter light turned almost beautiful. Rosalind did not find it beautiful. She watched the floor and she waited. Garland had been working for nearly 40 minutes when the sound changed. Not the jackhammer, the concrete. The pitch shifted and went sharper, and then came that single metallic clang that rang through the whole barn like a bell struck once and left to fade. Garland killed the compressor immediately. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rosalind had heard in weeks. He knelt without a word and began clearing debris with his hands, brushing chunks of broken concrete to the side with the patience of a man who understood that hurrying now would cost more than it saved. Rosalind came forward and knelt beside him. Beneath the rubble, dull gray steel caught the thin light filtering down through the gaps in the roof. Garland sat back on his heels. "Steel plate," he said, "quarter-inch at least, maybe more rare." He cleared a wider area, working the edges until the full outline was visible. 4 feet square set into a steel frame that had been anchored into the concrete foundation with bolts as thick as Rosalind's thumb. On the near side, a combination lock secured a heavy latch. Garland looked at the installation for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Your father put this here." "It wasn't here when I was a child," Rosalind said. "Or if it was, I never knew." "This is not something a man builds on a weekend," Garland said. "This took planning, real planning." Rosalind was already reaching into her coat pocket. The watch came out warm from being against her body, and she turned it over in her palm and looked at the 4 numbers on the back, the way she had looked at them 100 times in 22 years, always assuming they were a date, always moving on because the assumption had seemed harmless. She knelt beside the lock, left to the first number, right to the second, left to the third, right to the fourth. The lock opened with a click that was very small given how much it changed. Neither of them spoke. Garland looked at the open lock and then at Rosalind, and then at the open lock again. Rosalind looked at the lock and felt something move through her that was not quite emotion and not quite thought, something more fundamental than either, the sensation of a thing that has been waiting a very long time finally arriving. "He gave it to me when he was dying," she said. Her voice was steady. "He said I'd know when I needed it. I've been carrying it for 22 years without knowing what it was for." Garland reached for the latch. Rosalind put her hand on the steel plate before he could. "I'll go first," she said. "This is my father's. Whatever is down there, I'll go first." The hatch was heavier than it looked. They lifted it together, Garland taking most of the weight, and it swung back on hinges that groaned from decades of disuse. Cold air rose from the opening. Not the cold of a root cellar or a crawl space, but something more deliberate, more controlled, carrying a smell that Rosalind could not immediately classify. Something sweet. Something with an edge underneath the sweetness, faintly chemical, faintly organic, like wood and time and intention, all combined. Below them, a steel ladder descended into dark. Garland held his flashlight out to her. Rosalind took it, gripped the top rung, and lowered herself down. She counted the rungs as she went. 8 of them, solid and cold under her palms, bolted to the concrete wall at regular intervals. Her feet touched the bottom, and she turned and raised the flashlight and swept the beam across the space in front of her and stopped breathing. The room was enormous. She had expected a root cellar. She had expected some modest, hidden space, a few shelves, maybe a strong box, some small secret a farmer might keep from the revenue men. What the flashlight showed her instead was a vault that stretched the full length and width of the barn above a room dug out of the Kentucky clay and lined floor to ceiling with poured concrete walls and a ceiling reinforced with steel beams. Somewhere in the walls, she could hear a faint mechanical hum, a ventilation system of some kind still running after decades, still doing the job it had been built to do. And filling the room row after row after row from the floor to the height of her head and above were wooden shelving units, hundreds of them. And on every shelf, packed close and standing upright, were glass bottles, each one sealed with dark wax, each one bearing a handwritten label. Rosalind walked forward as though pulled. She reached the nearest shelf and lifted a bottle carefully. The glass was thick. The wax seal was unbroken, the surface slightly rough with age. The label was written in her father's handwriting, the same careful script she recognized from grocery lists and birthday cards, the handwriting of a man who did everything with deliberate attention. Branscombe Reserve, 1958, Barrel 7, Bottle 43. She held it up to this flashlight beam. The liquid inside was the color of dark amber, perfectly clear without a trace of sediment. Garland came down the ladder behind her. His flashlight joined hers, and they stood side by side in the middle of a room that should not have existed, surrounded by thousands of bottles that should not have been there. "Good Lord," Garland said softly. Rosalind walked the shelves. The bottles were organized by year. She found labels from 1951 at the far end, then 1952, then each successive year moving along the wall, a library of time, every bottle dated and numbered and cataloged by a man who had worked alone in secret for reasons she did not yet understand. She counted shelves and did the arithmetic, and the number she arrived at made her stop walking. "How many do you think?" she asked. Garland had been counting too. 5,000, he said, "maybe more." Rosalind set the 1958 bottle back on its shelf. Her father had been making whiskey. Aldous Branscombe, who had driven the same truck for 20 years and patched his own boots, and lived simply and died with nothing in his bank account, had been running a distilling operation underneath his barn for nearly 2 decades, had bottled and sealed the results and stored them in a temperature-controlled vault he had built with his own hands. She turned to the workbench near the base of the ladder. It was clean and organized in a way nothing else on the property had managed to remain. The tools on the pegboard above it, hanging in their outlines, a set of precision instruments and a wooden rack, everything undisturbed. And in the center of the bench, held down by a bottle of dark glass, was an envelope. Her name was written on the front. She knew the handwriting. Garland turned off his flashlight without being asked and stood quietly in the dark at the far side of the room, giving her whatever privacy a room underground could offer. Rosalind pulled the lamp she had brought in a bag over her shoulder, plugged it into the extension cord Garland had run down from above, and sat on the stool at the workbench with the envelope in her hands. The paper was yellowed but intact. The wax seal on the back was pressed with what looked like a coin. She broke it and unfolded 7 pages of her father's careful handwriting. "Rosalind," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I owe you the truth about why I was never the father you deserved." She read without stopping. Aldous Branscombe had started making whiskey in 1949. He was 24 years old, recently home from the war, living with her mother in a 2-room house with a dirt floor and a well that went dry every August. 60 acres of land that would not grow anything worth selling. A pregnant wife, and a skill he had learned from his own father in the mountains. A skill that was illegal at the federal level, in the state level, in the county level, and had been for decades. He had been good at it, better than good. The bourbon he produced was clean and smooth and aged correctly, and word moved the way word moves in places where people know what they are looking for. Men came from Lexington and Nashville and as far as Louisville to buy what he was making. He charged premium prices, and he got them. By 1953, he had enough money to build the vault. He had poured the foundation himself and hired a crew from out of state to do the concrete work. Men who did not know where they were and did not ask. He had dug the space by hand, every shovelful of clay, every bucketful of dirt carried up and scattered across the back field over 2 years so that nothing would be obvious from the air or from the road. When it was finished, he had a room that no one knew about under a barn, no one watched on a farm, no one cared about. He had made whiskey for 18 years. Rosalind's mother had known and had helped with the bottling in the early years before her health declined. Rosalind turned the page. The handwriting grew smaller, more controlled. In 1962, a man named Roy Decker had come to the farm with 2 other men. Decker had been Aldis's partner, his distributor, his friend for nearly a decade. He had grown greedy. He wanted a larger share. When Aldis refused, Decker threatened to go to the Federal Revenue Office. When that threat did not move, Aldis Decker came in person. "I did what I had to do to protect my family," Aldis had written. "I will not put the details on paper. You don't need them, and I am not proud of them, though I have never once in all the years since wished I had done differently." After that night, Aldis had shut everything down. He had sealed the vault and poured fresh concrete over the hatch and never touched the operation again. He had lived on what the farm produced and what small jobs he could find quietly without drawing attention for the rest of his life. A man who shows the world everything he has, Aldis had written, is a man who has already begun to lose it. There was a name on the next page that Rosalind had not expected. Orville Gantry, a man from the Federal Revenue Office who had come to the farm in 1963 and told Aldous he knew what had been happening, but had no evidence and was not going to look for any. Orville Gantry had kept that silence for 60 years. Aldous had written, "If he is still alive when you find this, he deserves to know it mattered." The final paragraphs were the ones that made her set the letter down for a moment and look at the shelves around her. "I left the farm to you," Aldous had written. "The lawyer in Dawson has the documents. No one can take this land from you, Rosalind. Not your husband, not your children, not a court. It is yours until you decide otherwise. I know I was not the father you needed me to be. I was always in that barn when you needed me in the house. I was building something for you even when I could not say what. The bottles are worth money, real money, more than the house and the agency and whatever Gordon put in the bank. But that is not why I kept them. I kept them because they were mine, and because I wanted there to be something that was yours. The people who love your money are never the people who love you. Trust the ones who show up when you have nothing. Your father, Aldous." Rosalind folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket next to the watch. She sat at her father's workbench in the cold and the quiet and looked at the rows of bottles stretching away from her in every direction, and she thought about a man who had spent his whole life building something in secret and had trusted his daughter to find it because he knew she was the only one who would stay. Garland's voice came from the far side of the room. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. He turned his flashlight back on and came to stand near the bench. He looked at her face and did not ask anything else, which was one of the things she was already coming to understand about him. "My father was not a farmer," she said. "He was a distiller. He spent his whole life hiding a fortune under this barn because the one time he trusted the wrong person, it almost cost him everything." Garland was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" Rosalind looked at the shelves. "I need to find out what it's worth, and I need someone who knows how to be quiet about it." They covered the hatch with a sheet of plywood and spread hay over it until the floor looked undisturbed. Rosalind drove the 2 locking bolts shut on the barn's interior latch and then climbed out through the window on the south wall that Garland had found earlier, and they walked back to the house without speaking. The next morning she asked Garland about spirits appraisers. Garland knew a man in Louisville who had assessed a private collection for an estate the previous year. 3 phone calls later, she had a name: Archibald Holloway. 50 years old, had worked with auction houses in New York and London, had consulted for 2 museum collections, was known in the trade for his discretion. She called him from Garland's phone. She told him she had a collection of vintage bourbon in Kentucky that had been in storage for decades and that she needed a professional assessment. She gave him nothing else. He arrived 4 days later in a car that cost more than Rosalind's truck had. She watched his face when he came down the ladder, and his flashlight swept across the shelves. He stood at the bottom for 30 full seconds without moving or speaking. Then he walked the room methodically, pulling bottles at random, holding them up to his light, checking the wax, examining the labels, making notes on a clipboard. He worked for nearly an hour. When he finished, he sat in the second chair Rosalind had placed beside the bench and rubbed his face with both hands before he said anything. "Who made this?" he asked. "My father." "Your father was a genius." He set his clipboard on his knee. "The aging process, the storage conditions, the sealing technique. I have evaluated collections in London and Edinburgh, and I have never seen this level of care applied to this volume of product. This is not a hobby project. This is a life's work." "How much?" Rosalind said. He was quiet for a moment. "I cannot give you a final number without full authentication. Chemical analysis, provenance documentation, independent verification. But based on what I am seeing here, based on the volume and the age and the condition, you are looking at a collection worth somewhere between $20 and $30 million. The number sat in the cold air between them. Rosalind did not react. The number was large enough that reacting to it before understanding it would be a mistake. "What do you recommend?" she asked. "Do not flood the market," Holloway said immediately. "A collection this size released all at once would suppress its own value. You want small batches through private buyers and selective auction houses stretched over 5 to 10 years. He paused. "If you needed liquidity quickly, I could connect you with private collectors who would buy a first batch tomorrow. Pre-authentication based on my preliminary assessment. You would see somewhere around 400,000 for 100 bottles. Do it, Rosalind said. He left that afternoon with 10 bottles for laboratory testing. Rosalind walked him to his car. Keep this quiet, she said. Nobody else needs to know yet. Discretion is part of my professional reputation, Mrs. Pruitt, he said and drove away. Garland was sitting on the porch steps when she came back. 20 to 30 million, he said, not as a question. Yes. He looked out at the fields. Your father sat on this for decades. He was afraid, Rosalind said. He was afraid of what knowing would do to people, including me. She sat down beside Garland on the steps. First, I'm going to pay the back taxes. Then I'm going to fix this house. Then I'll figure out what comes after. She went to see Thaddeus Branscombe Jr. the next morning, the lawyer whose father had kept Aldis's documents in a filing cabinet for 40 years. The office was above the post office on Dawson's Main Street, reached by a staircase that announced every step. Thaddeus was 55 with a desk buried under folders in a coffee mug that had been there long enough to leave a ring. He found Aldis's file in the back cabinet, read through it, and looked up. Irrevocable Living Trust, he said. Established 1982. The farm, the land, all structures, all contents within the property boundary. You are the sole beneficiary. Your husband had no claim to it. Your children have no standing to challenge it without medical evidence of incapacity. He set the file down. Mrs. Pruitt, may I ask what is in the barn? My father's life's work, Rosalind said. She paid his consultation fee in cash and walked back down the stairs. The first private sale came through 10 days later. 40 bottles from the 1951 and 1952 vintages sold to a collector in Louisville. The total was $160,000. Rosalind drove to the county assessor's office that same afternoon and paid the back taxes in full with a cashier's check. $11,000 plus the current year's assessment. She kept every receipt in a folder labeled simply with the year. She opened a bank account at the local branch in Dawson. She bought a used Chevrolet pickup from a lot in the next town over, 10 years old with rust on the fenders, but a solid engine, and drove it home on roads she was beginning to know the feel of. Garland helped her clear the driveway and repair the fence along the road frontage over the following 2 weeks. The farm began slowly and without drama to look like a place where someone lived and intended to stay. Rosalind did not call her children. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not feel the need to report her whereabouts to anyone. She was in the hardware store 3 weeks after the first sale when Laverne Fulcher stopped her near the register. I heard you paid off the Branscombe back taxes, Laverne said. I did. In full. In full. Laverne looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone revising an earlier assessment. Then she nodded once slowly and turned back to her crossword without another word. But something had shifted. Rosalind could feel it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, not dramatic, not announced, simply present. She was loading her groceries into the truck when the certified letter arrived in the mailbox that evening, forwarded from Clifford's address, postmarked from a law office in Columbus. Her son and daughter were petitioning the county court to declare her mentally incompetent and appoint Clifford as conservator of her person and estate, including all trust property. The petition cited her age, her sudden relocation to an isolated rural property, her apparent confusion regarding financial matters, and her vulnerability to exploitation by unknown third parties. The unknown third party Rosalind understood was Garland Sutter. She read it twice. Then she folded it and went inside and sat at the kitchen table. She was not afraid. She was not even surprised. She had seen Marvella's face in that one unguarded second at the dining room table, and she had understood then that the conversation was not over. What she felt sitting at the kitchen table in the house her grandfather had built on land her father had protected for her entire life was clarity. Her children had taken everything she had shared with them willingly. Now they were coming for the one thing she had not. She picked up the phone and called Garland. I need your help, she said, and I'm going to need that lawyer. Garland came over that same evening with the court papers spread between them on the kitchen table and a pot of coffee going on the stove. He read through the petition slowly and set it down when he finished. They filed this without a doctor, he said, without any medical testimony at all. They filed it because they don't know how much there is, Rosalind said. They can see the truck and the repairs and the taxes paid. They just can't see where it's coming from, and that frightens Clifford more than anything I could have said to him directly. Garland looked at her across the table. Outside, the February wind moved through the bare trees along the property line, and the house settled into its foundation with the small sounds old houses make when the temperature drops. You need to tell Thaddeus everything, Garland said. Not some of it, everything. The vault, the bottles, the appraiser, the sale. You cannot walk into that courtroom with half the story on the table. She knew he was right. She had been operating on instinct since the morning she had stepped off the bus in Dawson, making one decision at a time, building forward without a plan. That approach had carried her this far. A courtroom required something different. She called Thaddeus Branscombe Jr. the next morning and drove to his office with the court papers and a banker's box she had spent the previous night assembling. Inside the box were Aldis's letter, the trust documents, Holloway's preliminary report, the bank statements showing the first deposit and its expenditures and receipts for every dollar she had spent since arriving at the farm, the tax payment, the house repairs, the truck, the groceries. Every transaction accounted for in chronological order. Thaddeus read the conservatorship petition while Rosalind sat across the desk and waited. When he finished, he set it down and shook his head slowly. This is the weakest filing I have seen in 30 years of practice, he said. No medical evidence, no psychiatric evaluation, no testimony from a treating physician. That is not a conservatorship case. That is a family disagreement dressed up in legal language. Will a judge take it seriously? A judge is required to give it a hearing, but the burden of proof is on them, and they have no proof. He paused. What they're hoping is that you won't show up prepared. Rosalind opened the banker's box and placed Holloway's preliminary report on the desk. There's something else you need to know, she said. She told him about the vault. She told him about the bottles and the letter and the 18 years of production and the first sale and the account in Dawson. Thaddeus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. 20 to 30 million, he said quietly. That's the estimate, and your children don't know the scale. They know I have resources. They don't know the source. Rosalind set her hands on the desk. What I need to know is whether they can reach it. Thaddeus leaned forward. Here's the situation. The trust protects the land and everything on it. Even if Clifford won the conservatorship, the trust would prevent any transfer of the farm or the vault. But a conservator could potentially control your personal assets, your bank account, the proceeds from sales. He paused. So we cannot let them win. And with what you have in this box, we are not going to. He told her what he needed: complete medical records, a statement from her physician, and every piece of paper she had brought, organized exactly as she had organized it, because preparation tells its own story about the person who did it. The hearing was set for January 9th. Rosalind had 3 weeks. She drove to Columbus and sat in the office of Dr. Winifred Halstead, who had been her physician for 15 years and who listened to the full account of the preceding months without interrupting and then performed a complete cognitive assessment with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the results would be read by people looking for any opening. When it was done, Dr. Halstead wrote a statement in language precise enough to close every door. Patient demonstrates exceptional clarity of reasoning and strong executive function, she read aloud as she handed Rosalind the printed copy. There is no clinical basis for any finding of incapacity. She looked at Rosalind over the top of her glasses. For what it's worth, I have rarely administered this assessment to someone who found it less challenging. Rosalind folded the statement and put it in the banker's box. In the hallway outside the elevator, a man was waiting on the bench beside the potted plant. He was 52, well-dressed in the specific way of lawyers who bill by the hour, and he stood when he saw her. Mrs. Pruitt. Dalton Crane had a voice calibrated for conference rooms. I think we both know this situation could be resolved without a courtroom. Then tell my son to withdraw the petition, Rosalind said. She did not slow her pace. Crane fell into step beside her. Clifford is concerned. He'd like to understand where the resources are coming from. Someone in your position recently widowed isolated new financial relationships could be a target. Rosalind stopped walking and looked at him directly. Mr. Crane, you came to my doctor's office to intercept me after my appointment. That tells me everything I need to know about how strong your case is. Crane held her gaze. There's a simpler path here, a voluntary arrangement. You retain autonomy over day-to-day matters. Clifford handles larger financial decisions. I have been handling larger financial decisions since before your client could drive, Rosalind said. Good day. She walked to the elevator and did not look back. She called Holloway from the farm that evening and asked him to accelerate the next sale. 200 bottles from the oldest section of the vault, the 1951 and 1952 vintages, sold over 10 days to 3 separate collectors. Each transaction documented each buyer under confidentiality agreement. The total came to $480,000 wired to her account in Dawson. She used it precisely. Property taxes paid forward for 5 years. $50,000 into a repair fund for the farm structures. Thaddeus Branscombe Jr. retained on a formal basis. The remainder held liquid in the account, every dollar documented, every decision, leaving a paper trail that said one thing clearly to anyone who cared to read it. This woman knows exactly what she is doing. Garland came 3 evenings that week and sat with her at the kitchen table while she organized the final version of the banker's box. He went through the timeline with her event by event, date by date, letting her recite it until it came without effort. At the end of the 3rd evening, he stood up to go and paused at the door. Whatever happens in that courtroom, he said, what you've built here was already worth something before any of it. She thought she understood what he meant. She would not fully understand until much later. The courthouse in the county seat was a 40-minute drive on roads Rosalind now knew well enough to drive in the dark. She arrived at 8:15 for a 9 o'clock hearing in a gray wool dress she had bought at the shop on Dawson's Main Street, the pocket watch pinned to her lapel where she could feel its weight without looking at it. The courtroom was small and wood-paneled with fluorescent lights that produced a sound just below the threshold of annoyance. Clifford sat on the left side of the aisle with Dalton Crane and a leather briefcase. Harriet sat beside her brother with her hands folded in her lap and an expression that had been assembled with care. Rosalind sat on the right with Thaddeus Branscombe Jr. and the banker's box. Judge Nadine Hargrove was 60 years old with silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain and the bearing of someone who had heard a great deal of human difficulty across a long career and had not been made cynical by it, only precise. She read the petition in silence. She asked 3 procedural questions. Then she turned to Crane. Counselor, you filed for conservatorship based on alleged mental incapacity. Walk me through your evidence. Crane stood. He told the story he had prepared the grieving widow who had abandoned her family home and relocated without explanation to a dilapidated rural property, the unexplained financial activity, the presence of unknown parties. He used the phrase concerning pattern 4 times. He said the family's intention was protective. We are not alleging wrongdoing, Crane said carefully. We are asking the court to ensure that Mrs. Pruitt's interests are protected by someone with the standing and the resources to do so effectively. Judge Hargrove let him finish. Then she looked at Rosalind's side of the room. Thaddeus stood and opened the banker's box. He placed the documents on the table in the order Rosalind had arranged them. Dr. Halstead's assessment and written statement. The trust documents showing clear and unencumbered ownership of the property. Bank statements showing deposits, expenditures, and a current balance that required no explanation. Tax receipts. Repair invoices with contractor signatures. The truck purchase agreement. A timeline printed on 3 pages, each event dated and sourced. Mrs. Pruitt relocated to a property she owns outright, Thaddeus said. Held in an irrevocable trust established by her father in 1982. She paid $11,000 in overdue property taxes within weeks of arriving. She restored the residence, purchased transportation, opened a bank account, and has maintained a documented and positive financial position since. Her physician of 15 years has certified her as cognitively sound with no clinical basis for any finding of incapacity. He set his hands flat on the table. The petitioners have filed this action without a single piece of medical evidence. They have speculation. We have documentation. Crane raised the question of the financial activity's origin, pressing on the point that a woman who had arrived with minimal resources now had a substantial account balance. Thaddeus did not hesitate. The source of the funds is the trust property itself. Mrs. Pruitt discovered assets on the farm left by her father, assets that fall within the trust boundary and therefore belong solely to her, and she has been liquidating them through legitimate channels. Every transaction is documented. Every dollar is accounted for. Judge Hargrove removed her glasses. She looked at Clifford and Harriet for a long moment with the expression of someone delivering a verdict that is not close. This petition has no medical basis, she said. The respondent has demonstrated clear, consistent, and competent management of her affairs over an extended period. The documentation before this court is thorough, organized, and entirely inconsistent with the picture the petitioners have attempted to draw. She paused. Mr. Pruitt, I will note for the record that filing a conservatorship petition without medical evidence wastes this court's time and causes genuine harm to the person being petitioned. I would encourage you to reflect on that before considering any further action. The gavel came down. Clifford's face went the color of old brick. Crane was already closing his briefcase with the practiced movement of a man who had lost before and had developed a system for leaving rooms quickly. Harriet was looking at her hands. Rosalind picked up the banker's box, thanked Thaddeus in a voice low enough that only he could hear, and walked out of the courtroom. She made it to the hallway before Clifford came through the door behind her. Mom. His voice was tight in the way voices get when a person is controlling something that wants to come out differently. What assets? What did you find on that farm? Rosalind turned. She looked at her son. She had not looked at him directly since sitting across the mahogany table in his dining room. And she looked at him now the way you look at something you have been avoiding because you knew it would cost you something to see it clearly. She saw Gordon in his jawline. She saw herself in the stubbornness around his eyes. And underneath both of those things, she saw what Clifford did not know was visible, which was fear. Not greed. Fear. Your grandfather left me something, she said. How much is it worth? That is not your concern. I'm your son. Then act like it. Clifford took one step forward. You can't cut us out. Dad built everything with you. We're family. The house and the accounts were what your father and I built together, Rosalind said. You took those. The farm is mine. My father left it to me, not to your father, not to you, to me. I'll file again. His voice dropped. I'll find a doctor. I'll find whatever I need. Rosalind looked at him for a moment without speaking. When she spoke, her voice was not angry. It was simply final. You took what you could carry, Clifford. You just couldn't carry what mattered. She turned away from him and walked toward the far end of the hallway, and she did not look back, and he did not follow. At the courthouse entrance, standing beside the potted fern near the main doors, was a man she had not expected to see. Orville Gantry was leaning on his cane with the stillness of someone who has been waiting patiently for a very long time and had made his peace with the waiting. He was 82 years old, and he had driven 3 hours to be here. I read the petition in the public record, he said when she reached him. He took her hand in both of his with deliberate warmth. I wanted to make sure you had what you needed. You came to the funeral, Rosalind said. You told me Gordon should have protected me better. I meant it. My father mentioned you in his letter. He said if you were still alive, I should let you know it mattered. Orville nodded slowly as though he had been carrying this for a long time and was ready to set it down. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small envelope. Inside was a single folded document, a typed statement on federal letterhead dated 1963, signed by Orville Gantry in his capacity as a revenue officer. The statement confirmed that a property inspection at the Aldous Branscombe farm on County Road 9 had found no evidence of illegal activity and that the matter was being closed without further investigation. I wrote it the way I wrote it so that it would hold up, Orville said, in case anyone ever came looking later. No one ever did. He paused. Your father lived his whole life expecting the past to arrive at his door. I spent 60 years making sure it didn't. Rosalind held the document carefully, looking at the signature, at the date, at the official seal that had protected her father across 6 decades without his ever knowing for certain that it had. Why, she asked. Orville considered the question. Because Aldous Branscombe told me once when I asked him why he had settled in that particular county on that particular stretch of road that he had a daughter, and he wanted her to grow up somewhere she could have choices he never had. He paused. I thought that was worth something. Rosalind put the document inside her coat pocket against the same side where the watch rested. Harriet was waiting at the main doors. She had been crying in the unself-conscious way of someone who had stopped managing her appearance sometime earlier and did not care anymore. The mascara was gone. Her eyes were swollen and her hands were at her sides. Mom, her voice came out rough. I'm sorry. Rosalind waited. I'm sorry for the accounts. I knew what we were doing. I knew it the whole time. And I told myself it was practical, and I told myself we were protecting you. But that was not what it was. She stopped and started again. We were protecting ourselves from having to take care of you. That's the truth. And I have not slept properly since the hearing was filed because I knew this was wrong and I did it anyway. Why, Rosalind asked. Because Clifford made it sound logical, Harriet said. Because it was easier to believe him than to admit what we were actually doing. Because I stopped being your daughter somewhere along the way, and I don't entirely know when that happened. They stood in the courthouse lobby with people moving around them in both directions, the ordinary traffic of a Tuesday morning. You can come back, Rosalind said. When you're ready to come back as my daughter, not as someone calculating what I have. Do you understand the difference? Harriet nodded. She could not speak. Then go home. Take the time you need. When you're ready, you know where I am. Rosalind reached out and touched Harriet's arm. The car. Keep it. Harriet looked up. Your father would have wanted you to have reliable transportation, Rosalind said. That part of what we built, he would have wanted you to have that. Harriet started crying again, differently this time, and Rosalind held her once briefly and completely before stepping back. She drove home through a Kentucky that was only beginning to hint at spring beneath the gray of February. The fields on either side were still brown and flat, but there was something in the color of the sky, some slight warming in the light, that suggested the season was making decisions, even if it had not announced them yet. Spring did arrive, and slowly the way things arrive when they are real. The crocuses came first, pushing through the half-frozen ground near the porch steps. Then the grass turned from brown to green, starting at the fence lines and working inward. By late March, the fields were running with color, wild growth, and new growth tangled together in every direction. The farmhouse was white on all 4 sides now. The porch had new cedar planks that Garland had milled himself from a fallen tree at the property line. Both upstairs windows were intact. The kitchen was rewired. The plumbing was reliable. The barn had a new roof and reinforced walls, though Rosalind had left the interior exactly as it was, the hatch covered, and locked the hay undisturbed. Holloway handled placement, small batches through vetted buyers and selective houses, documentation on every transaction. Rosalind kept the records herself, paying quarterly taxes and maintaining the account in Dawson with the precision of someone who understood that every dollar needed to be able to tell its own story. She was 71 now. Her birthday had come in February without ceremony. Garland had appeared that morning with a lemon cake from the bakery in town, and they had eaten it on the porch in the cold. And he had said happy birthday, and she had said thank you, and that had been entirely sufficient. One afternoon in early April, Rosalind drove to a building on the edge of Dawson's main street, a converted storefront that had been a pharmacy for 40 years and had been empty for 3. She had bought it in February for $68,000. Garland had spent 3 weeks on the interior, new flooring, fresh paint, good lighting, a counter along one wall with space for 2 people to sit and talk without feeling like they were being processed. The sign above the door read Branscombe Community Aid. Below it in smaller letters, Housing Assistance. legal referral, emergency support. She had named it for her father because he had spent his life building something to protect one person, and she wanted to extend that logic outward. The idea had come from a woman named Gertrude Winslow. Rosalind had met her at the grocery store in March, standing in the canned goods aisle with the expression of someone who had arrived somewhere and forgotten why. Gertrude was 67 and had been widowed 4 months earlier. Her son had transferred the title of her house into his name during the week Gertrude spent planning her husband's funeral. By the time Gertrude had understood what had happened, the transfer was recorded and her son's name was on the deed. Rosalind had listened to the whole story in the canned goods aisle. She had recognized every part of it. "I don't know what my rights are," Gertrude had said. "I don't even know if I have any." "You have rights," Rosalind said. "Come with me." She had driven Gertrude to Thaddeus Branscombe Jr.'s office that same afternoon. It turned out Gertrude had significant legal standing. It turned out the transfer had been improperly executed in ways that a competent attorney could address. It turned out that what Gertrude had needed was someone to ask the right question to the right person. "I didn't know there was someone to call," Gertrude said on the drive back. "That's the problem," Rosalind said. The center opened on a Wednesday morning in April with no ribbon cutting and no press release. Just a door that was unlocked at 8 o'clock and a sign that was visible from the street. A social worker from the county office came to help with intake. Thaddeus agreed to donate 2 afternoons a month. Gertrude herself came in and stayed, becoming the person who answered the phone and made the coffee and remembered everyone's name. Within 3 weeks, they were seeing 12 to 15 people a week. Elderly men whose children had moved them out of their homes, widows tangled in probate, veterans who could not parse the benefit system, people who had arrived somewhere they had not planned to be and did not know what questions to ask. Rosalind did not counsel them. She connected them. She was there when the door opened and there when it closed, and she made coffee and sat with whoever needed to sit. And she never once told anyone that she understood what they were going through, because she had spent enough years listening to people to know that claiming understanding too quickly was a way of closing the conversation before it had really opened. Garland volunteered on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He drove people to appointments and helped with the paperwork and never discussed any of it afterward. He simply showed up and did the work, which was the same thing he had done from the beginning. On the day the center opened, Laverne Fulcher walked through the door at 9:15. She looked at the counter and the chairs and the sign on the wall, and she turned to Rosalind. "I have a cousin," she said, 72. Her stepson moved her into a memory care facility without her consent and sold the house she'd lived in for 40 years. "Bring her in," Rosalind said. Laverne nodded. She stood for another moment looking at the room. "I almost told Garland not to go out to your farm that first morning when he mentioned it in the store." "Why didn't you?" "Because Garland Sutter does what he believes is right regardless of what I say. I've known him for 30 years. She looked at Rosalind. "But I thought you should know I wasn't sure about you. Not at the start." "You were being careful," Rosalind said. "That's not a flaw." "No," Laverne said. "But I was wrong about you, and I don't like being wrong, so I prefer to acknowledge it and move on." She left without further ceremony and sent her cousin the following Monday. The call from Harriet came on a Saturday in May while Rosalind was turning the soil in the kitchen garden she had planted behind the house. "Mom, it's Harriet. Can I come visit? Not for anything, just to come." "Come Friday," Rosalind said. Harriet arrived in the early evening in her own car, the one Rosalind had told her to keep, with a weekend bag and none of the folder-carrying energy of the previous year. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the house. "You finished the paint," she said. "Garland did the back 2 sides, I did the front and the east." They sat on the porch while the light went orange and then pink across the fields. Harriet talked in a way she had not talked to Rosalind in years about her marriage and what was happening inside it, about work that felt like going through motions, about the grandchildren who asked sometimes why they had not seen their grandmother. Rosalind listened without filling the silences with reassurance, because Harriet was not asking for reassurance. She was asking to be heard without it being managed. On Saturday morning, Harriet followed Rosalind to the community center and sat in the corner for 2 hours. She watched a 73-year-old man named Arthur work through the paperwork for an appeal against a facility placement his daughter had arranged while he was in the hospital for a hip replacement. She watched Rosalind ask him questions and write things down and make a phone call and schedule a follow-up with Thaddeus. She watched the man leave looking less lost than when he had arrived. During the lunch break, when Gertrude was holding the desk, Harriet asked Rosalind if she could look at the intake form they use for new visitors. Rosalind handed it to her. Harriet read it twice and asked 2 questions about the process and then folded it carefully and put it in her bag. Before she left on Sunday morning, Harriet stood at the top of the porch steps with her bag over her shoulder. "That intake form," she said, "the process. I want to understand it better." She paused. "I have some contacts in Columbus, people who work in family law. Some of what you're doing here there might be ways to connect it to resources that would expand the reach." Rosalind looked at her daughter. This was not Harriet arriving to take something. This was Harriet arriving with something to offer. "Call me when you have something specific," Rosalind said. Harriet hugged her at the car, not briefly, not with the managed warmth of the preceding year, but with the full and unguarded weight of someone returning to a place they had been away from too long. Rosalind held on and led her. When Harriet's car had gone down the driveway and turned onto County Road 9 and disappeared, Rosalind walked to the barn. She unlocked the door and went inside and lifted the plywood and opened the hatch and climbed down. She did not bring a lamp. She had been down enough times by now that the space was familiar, even in the dark, and she wanted it dark. She sat on the stool at the workbench and listened to the ventilation hum in the walls. A package had arrived that week from Louisville. Orville Gantry had sent it with a note in his unsteady handwriting. He had found the technical notebook in Aldis's things, the one Aldis had left with him in 1971, with instructions to forward it to Rosalind if she ever found the vault. Orville had written, "I am 82 years old and glad I got to wait long enough." The notebook was leather-bound, brown and worn. Inside, Aldis had recorded everything in the careful script he used for everything. Temperatures and times and barrel compositions and yield measurements. 18 years of craft documented with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the work deserved to be recorded, even if it could never be shown to anyone. On the last page, in handwriting that looked slightly younger than the rest, as though it had been written earlier and placed at the end intentionally, and Aldis had written a single entry that had nothing to do with whiskey. Rosalind laughed today, really laughed, at the kitchen table at nothing. "I was in the barn, but I heard it through the wall. I thought everything I have ever done is worth that sound." She sat with the notebook in her lap in the dark room her father had built by hand, with a shovel and a bucket and 30 years of patience, and she understood for the first time what Garland had meant on the evening before the hearing, when he had told her that the farm had already been worth something before any of it. Her father had not built the vault because he was afraid of losing the whiskey. He had built it because he was afraid of losing her. The whiskey was the instrument. She was the reason. And the difference between those two things was everything. She sat there for a while in the quiet, not thinking in the ordinary sense, just being in the place her father had made for her without being able to say so. And then she climbed the ladder and closed the hatch and walked out of the barn into the afternoon. Garland was at the south field, walking the perimeter with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ground the way he looked at things he was measuring in his mind. "I want to plant that field," Rosalind said when she reached him. Garland kept looking at the ground. "What do you want to plant?" "Something that takes a long time. Something you have to commit to." "I know a man who grows heritage grain," Garland said. "Old varieties, takes 4 years before the first real harvest." "That sounds right." Garland nodded once slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. They stood side by side at the edge of the south field and looked at the ground that had been her grandfather's, and then her father's, and was now hers, and the late afternoon light came across it flat and golden, the way spring light does in open country, touching everything equally, making no distinctions. The next morning, she stopped at Buford's Diner before heading out to meet the man about the grain. It was the kind of place that had been on Dawson's Main Street long enough that people stopped noticing it was there, which was exactly why it was always full. Buford Granger, 71 years old, carvings on every wooden stool from veterans who had passed through over the decades, poured coffee without being asked, and set the cup on the counter in front of the stool, at the far end the same one Aldis had used. Heard you're planting the South Field, Buford said. Heritage grain, 4 years before first harvest. Buford set his towel down. He looked at her with the straightforward attention of someone who had seen enough of life to know when something mattered. Aldous would have liked that. Rosalind lifted her coffee cup. Yeah, she said. I think he would have. She drank her coffee in the warm diner while the town moved past the window. Dawson going about its Tuesday morning, people with places to be, and things to carry, in small, ordinary purposes that were the actual substance of a life lived in one place. The pocket watch was in her coat pocket. She did not take it out. She did not need to look at the numbers anymore. They had done what they were meant to do. She finished her coffee, left the exact amount on the counter with a 15% tip, and walked out into the spring morning toward everything that was still ahead.